The main point to take away, though, from the analogy of the sun is that Plato is saying just as the sun, the physical sun that we experience, just as that governs the physical world, without it there would be no life, there would be no physical existence, we couldn't see nothing. So also there has to be a powerful force that governs the world of being. And that for Plato is the idea of the good, right? That form which is above and beyond every other form. It gives rise to the forms, it causes them to be. It's the source of knowledge and wisdom, but it itself is greater than knowledge and wisdom. Next, Plato goes into what's called the divided line. And if you can't see the screen very well, there's a nice little chart in our textbook. Pay close attention to that. The divided line is meant to shed light on the analogy of the sun. Okay, so each of these successive images that Plato presents here are meant to shed light on the previous one. So notice how the line's divided. It's divided in half. We have the world of appearances and the intelligible world. And it's also divided right down the middle in terms of the objects, but also the mental faculty that we use to understand and to experience and to learn about those objects. So let's take the bottom half of the line, the world of appearances. Notice that the lowest realm has to do with images. So the object would be something like a shadow or a reflection that we see in the water. And the mental state or faculty that we use would be the imagination. So the imagination will correspond to an image. Or maybe think of a fantastic creature that you come up with in your imagination. Well, you do so through the faculty of imagination, your ability to combine and to relate different parts, coming up with this mythological creature, for example. Next up the line, we have visible things. These are things that we can see, that we can experience through the five senses. And the mental state or faculty that we use to experience those objects is called belief, or trust, as some translations say. Well, think about it. Why would it be belief? Why would belief be the mental faculty we use to experience visible things? Well, for Plato and Aristotle, and I'll include Aristotle in here as well, one shouldn't spend their time trying to prove that a real physical world exists. Our very nature orients us toward a physical world. And in a way, we just take it on trust. We take it on belief. I mean, I don't try to prove that there's a physical object in front of me. I don't try to come up with a theoretical argument to prove that a physical world exists. Why would I need to do that when my very being is simply oriented and points toward that world? Notice the difference here between Plato and Aristotle as well, and a modern rationalist like Descartes. So think back to Descartes, who we looked at a couple weeks ago, and he didn't want to trust the senses. Descartes argued, due to the fact that the senses have deceived us in the past, why should we accept them in the future? Descartes was very skeptical of sensation and its ability to properly reflect reality. Not so for the ancient thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, who would have viewed the quest to prove what you're sensing is reliable as somewhat weird and maybe even odd. Visible things, Plato and Aristotle think, are experienced because we're trusting or believing in the reliability of our senses. So let's jump now into the intelligible world. The first thing we have are mathematical objects. These are known through universal principles, through thinking. Notice here, when we've jumped from the world of appearance to the intelligible world, we're going from sensation to reasoning itself, to abstract reasoning. So we don't see the number 3 anywhere in nature. However, 3 is a real number according to reason. Right? We need that number in order to make mathematical calculations. Thus, what characterizes the intelligible world is not sensation, physical changing objects, but universal objects, mathematical principles, things that don't change. So a triangle for us today is the same as a triangle was for the early Greek philosophers. That idea of a triangle hasn't changed, but has remained the same. Higher than mathematical objects for Plato are forms. Okay, these forms, as we know, are understood through dialectical reasoning or through intelligence. If we want real knowledge of a tree, we don't examine a particular tree that changes, that comes into existence and goes out of existence. We need to examine the idea or the form of a tree. And when we come up with that universal definition of treeness, of what it means to be a tree, according to Plato, we've arrived at real knowledge. Knowledge must meet 2 conditions for Plato. Number 1, it has to be infallible, and number 2, it has to be real. Knowledge, then, for Plato can only be acquired in the intelligible world. True knowledge cannot be had by looking around, by feeling, by tasting, by touching, hearing, etc. Knowledge can only be achieved when we have accessed the form and understood the form through reason itself. And finally, above and beyond all the forms is the form of the good, the idea of the good. So that principle that sheds light on and even makes knowable and gives existence to every other form in the intelligible world. Thus, you can see the hierarchy here. We go from images to visible things, mathematical objects, forms, and finally to the highest form, which is the idea of the good. And this is really a sketch of the cosmos for Plato. Everything that we encounter in the cosmos, in reality, will fall under one of the objects. Right? It's either a form, a mathematical principle, a visible thing, an image, etc. The divided line is really the sketch of the cosmos that Plato's Metaphysics seeks to understand. Okay, finally, we will conclude with Plato's metaphysical hierarchy and a brief statement on the allegory of the cave. Okay, as we've seen so far, being, in other words, the forms and the ideas, are the highest level of reality for Plato. And for Plato, the forms or ideas are most real because they're eternal and unchanging. And something that's eternal and unchanging possesses a nature different than something that is subject to change and something that comes into existence and quickly goes out of existence. Okay, thus being itself, pure being for Plato, is that highest level of reality. Becoming, or the world of becoming that we've talked about this far, is the world of sense particulars. It's less real. For Plato, it's more of a shadow world, where things are an imperfect copy or a weak imitation of that which is most highest, which would be the forms and ideas. Thus, a human being is an imperfect copy or a weak imitation of the idea of humanness, the idea of humanity itself. The world of becoming, then, would be a lower level of reality than the world of being. And finally, we have non-being, which is nothing, or the complete absence of reality. 3 different stages here for Plato's metaphysical hierarchy: the world of being, the world of becoming, and finally we have non-being, or the absence of reality. Notice the picture I have off to the side here. This is an illustration of Plato's famous allegory of the cave. I'm not going to say a lot here about the allegory of the cave because I'm in the process of writing up a brief response, or I should say a brief alternative interpretation of the cave. Okay, so be looking for that on the website. I'll post it under the online seminar, under Plato's Allegory of the Cave. But briefly, let me say this. First off, notice the prisoners. They're enchained. They're trapped, right? They can't look around. They can't look to the left, to the right. They can't look behind them. They're facing the wall. On the wall, we have various shadows. Those shadows are produced by the fire towards the exit and the various people on a raised wall who are carrying objects, man-made objects, artifacts. And it's by a combination of those artifacts and the fire towards the exit that these shadows are cast on the wall. Now, you'll read about this in the text, but you're going to read about how one person, one of the prisoners, escapes, gets free, leaves the shadow world, the world of the cave, and experiences nature itself. Basically having a vision of the sun. Okay, the physical sun. And Plato, as he's commonly read, uses this as an allegory to point to the human condition. That the human condition is really one of a prison world where all that we experience are shadows, pale images or pale reflections of what's really real. However, if you were born into this condition, you would think that the shadows on the wall represent what's most real. You would think that what you're experiencing is the highest level of reality. However, as the allegory illustrates, it's really the lowest level of reality. But the prisoners don't know it. And ultimately, the freed prisoner who is liberated from the cave doesn't know it until he completely escapes the cave and gets to the outer world where he's able to experience the physical sun for the first time. Now, all of this is an allegory, so it's not meant to be taken literally. Plato didn't literally think that human beings were born in a cave and somehow got free. It's meant to point to a higher truth. It's meant to illustrate a philosophical truth that's better captured in this image. The old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, that really applies here, because through this image, Plato thinks we have a better understanding of the human condition than we would if we simply